Who needs suffering? Welcome friends to Granny's GodPod number 45. Today I want to give you a transcription of part of a fascinating talk by the clinical psychologist Jordan B Peterson, in which he discusses suffering, the exodus from Egypt and the resurrection, to help us understand the purpose of pain and suffering. Peterson is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Toronto University. Peterson opens his discussion by saying that the reality of suffering is one certainty in this world. We can believe in the reality of our own pain, and to a lesser extent perhaps, we can believe in the pain of others. Pain is the most real thing we experience in life. It is undeniably real. But does that mean that which overcomes pain is even more real? That may be the substance behind the resurrection. Christian suffering is central to our lives in death, in pain. In the West, the Bible is the foundation of the lens in which we view the world. We are the avatars of the Christian faith, whether willingly or not, he says. In discussing the Exodus, Peterson says that Moses leading the Israelites through the desert has its beginnings with a tyrannical state, and the Spirit of God characterizes the Hebrew longing for freedom. The Spirit of God manifests itself within you in opposition to tyranny, and that is the paramount way in which God is represented in that story. He says, the Israelites are in the desert, and they're there for 40 years. And you might think, what kind of leadership did they have? It's not that big of a desert. But the answer is the desert after tyranny is no blooming joke, and maybe it takes 3 generations to get through it. And so the Israelites are wandering around in the desert, and what happens? The same thing happened to them as is happening to us. They're worshipping false idols, and they're tempted. And it's no wonder they're tempted because, well, they're in the desert and it's not going so well. So no wonder they're having a crisis of confidence. And maybe they're pining for the old days, and so they lack faith. And it's understandable, but despite it being understandable, and this is one of the harsh things about the story, what does God do when he hears their complaints? He sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. That's pretty brutal. And that's the sort of thing that makes the technical atheist types recoil about the conceptions of God in the Old Testament. It's not exactly what you'd expect, in some sense, from an all-merciful being. You've got these poor Israelites. First of all, they were in the tyranny. They have to cross the Red Sea. And now they're wandering around in the desert, and that's not good. And so your best solution is to send a bunch of snakes in to bite them. If you're in a little analogue of hell and you lose your faith, is that going to make it worse or better? And the answer is, well, I have reason to lose my faith. It's like, fair enough, that isn't the question. The question is what happens if you lose it, or you start looking for faith in the wrong directions. And the answer is, hell gets a little deeper. From studying atrocity, I realised on a metaphorical level that the reason hell is a bottomless pit is that no matter how bad it is, there's some blooming stupid thing that will make it worse. Peterson continues, the Israelites get tired of being bitten by the snakes and go to Moses and say, Do you want to go and have a chat with God, because you seem to be in there fairly tight with him? How about you get him to call off the snakes? Maybe we'll behave a little better. How's that for a deal? And Moses said, okay, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God, which is no trivial matter. And God doesn't do what you'd expect in order to make it a comprehensible narrative, to say, all right guys, you've been bitten enough, no more snakes. That isn't what happens. I think the reason it doesn't happen is that there's no getting rid of the snakes. I think that's also why there's a snake in the Garden of Eden. It's just there's no getting rid of snakes, you have to learn to live with them. Or maybe it's better to contend with snakes as to inhabit a world where there's no danger. God says something very interesting and very surprising from the perspective of a clinical psychologist. He tells Moses to cast a snake in bronze and to raise it up on a staff. The staff seems to me to be a reference to the staff of Moses, something like the thing you put into the ground to orientate yourself with. And maybe it's like the tree of life. It's like, here I stand. It's a centre point. It's all of that. And in any case, it's also the physician's symbol of healing, the staff with the snakes. And so it is a symbol of transformation. And partly that's because snakes shed their skin and are reborn. And so they are viewed as agents of transformation. And so that's all lurking in that symbol. And then God says, get the Israelites to go look at the snake on the staff, and then the poison won't poison them anymore. And I read that as a clinician and thought, that's really interesting, because one of the things all schools of psychotherapy learned in the last 100 years is that if you get people to voluntarily confront what makes them afraid and want to avoid, then they get better. It's curative. And that's the message there. It's like, if something is terrifying, you pay more attention to it. And that's what you teach people in psychotherapy. Of a variety of psychotherapy techniques, exposure is probably the cardinal technique. It could even be fear of the future, the indeterminate future. They don't get less afraid, they get braver, and that's different. It's not that they get accustomed to what they're looking at, and they're no longer afraid. That's not what happens. What really happens is they discover there's a lot more to themselves than they thought, and so they are not so easily intimidated. The serpent on the staff did not fix things. The snakes were still there. But it gave the Israelites the faith to contend with the problem. The transformation that takes place is in the focus of the suffering. It becomes a symbol of faith for them, as the cross does in John, where Jesus says thousands of years later, he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. That is a hell of a thing for anyone to say about anything ever. What does that mean? Why would the Son of God compare himself to a serpent? Why that particular serpent? The snake is the thing that threatens us. That's true biologically. We're wired to be afraid of serpents, especially poisonous ones. You may find and kill one snake, and then you find nests of snakes, and you go in and root them out. But then there are the snakes that are in the hearts of your enemies. That's a harder snake to deal with. And then there's the snake that's in your heart, and that's the hardest snake to deal with. And that's where the equation between the serpent and Satan comes in. If the snake is the worst fear, The passion is the sum total of all possible fears. It is the archetypal tragedy. The worst possible thing happens to someone who doesn't deserve it. Not only is Christ not merely innocent, he is also good. And not just good, but as good as it gets. And the passion is the worst of all punishments visited on the least deserving person. But that barely begins to scrape the surface. It's torture. Terrible torture, deliberately designed by the Romans. And so it's tragedy at the hands of your fellow man, motivated by the spirit of Cain. How can I achieve the most amount of torture in the shortest possible time? At a young age, with foreknowledge as a consequence of betrayal by one of your best friends, at the hands of a mob of your own people who are under Roman tyranny, who persecute you knowing that you are innocent, not just innocent but also good, and they choose to punish you instead of one they know to be criminal. It's the sum total of all possible fears. Speaking as a psychologist and not a theologist, Peterson says, "It's interesting to me that our culture has put at its centre an archetypal tragedy. It's as if we are trying to inoculate ourselves against the tragedy of life." Also, what's fascinating about the story of the Passion is that the crucifixion is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the resurrection. Jesus embraces his cross, his suffering. He breaks the power of the snake, and in doing so, it transforms others. What does that mean psychologically? Being terrified is not the end of the story. Recovery is the end of the story. So that begs the question, to what degree are we capable of bearing suffering and prevailing? And the answer might be, to the degree that we are capable of confronting it forthrightly. What's going to get the best out of you if it's not the most challenging? Are you grateful for your suffering as a consequence of that? I don't know. That's a high standard, and maybe it's unrealistic. The whole of Peterson's talk, in his inimitable style of taking you on a journey along his thought process, is on YouTube under the title "This Lesson from the Bible Will Make You Unstoppable," given at the Franciscan University of Steubenville on the 4th of April 2022. I hope you will look him up. He is always interesting, as is his journey to faith. See you next time. Have a great day now.